Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel News Update. And the Bible tells us in Zechariah chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 and Zechariah chapter 14 verses 1 and 2 that in the end of days the nations will come against Jerusalem. And we see the fulfillment of this prophecy as the Israeli-Palestinian peace process is being played out. And we have much news this week regarding the current status of the peace process. In the past week or so, Israel has announced new building construction in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. On August the 4th, as reported by YNetNews.com, Israel announced that there would be 930 new housing units built in East Jerusalem in Har Homa. And then on August the 11th, from YNetNews.com, Israel announced that there would be new housing projects built in East Jerusalem, and there would be 1,600 housing units in the neighborhood of Ramat Shlomo, another 700 new housing units built in Pisgat Ze'ev, and 2,000 units to be built in Givat HaMatos. And this happens to be across the Green Line, which refers to the 1967 borders. Furthermore, Israel announced that there would be 227 new homes built in the West Bank settlement of Ariel. And the report of this new planned Israel building in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem brought much condemnation from the international community. The European Union condemned the building, as well as Russia, the United Nations, and the United States. And then the quartet itself, which consists of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, who is to be the mediator regarding the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, they also condemned Israeli building to be done in East Jerusalem and particularly in the West Bank city of Ariel. Meanwhile, Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority says that in any future Palestinian state that he wants to see that Palestinian state free of Jews and free of settlements. And in the past week or so, the Palestinians have finalized their plans to come to the United Nations to seek recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And they have actually set the date of September the 20th to make this request of the United Nations. And part of the reason why the Palestinians selected this date, along with Friday, September the 23rd, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is going to be giving a speech at the United Nations, and choosing Friday is strategic for the Palestinians because this is the day that Arabs traditionally hold mass prayers in the Islamic faith, and since the onset of the Arab Spring, it is the day in which masses across the Arab world took to the streets to protest against various Arab governments. So the Palestinians hope to draw out the same masses in capital cities, not only in the Arab world, but in the West Bank as well, in support of their bid for a Palestinian state. And so the protests that are planned to take place in the Palestinian areas, they are meant to be peaceful protests. So in response to these things, The Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sent ambassadors to 40 countries to oppose this Palestinian state recognition. Meanwhile, the international community is expressing their concern about the Palestinians actually presenting their request to the United Nations, because the international community, in particular the United States and the European Union, has expressed that they would like to see direct negotiations take place between Israel and the Palestinians, rather than the Palestinians get recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital at the United Nations. So, in trying to prevent the Palestinians from going to the United Nations, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton has announced that she is going to make a trip to the Middle East this month, that is in August, to try to see what she can do in a last-minute hope to prevent the Palestinians from going to the United Nations. Furthermore, the European Union is trying to get the Palestinians to soften their UN resolution proposal so that it would be done in such a way that it could get support from all 27 European Union nations, because as it stands, there are some European Union nations that would support a Palestinian state at the United Nations, and there are other European Union nations who are expressing reservations at doing so. Therefore, there are intense talks that are going on between Israel and the United States, as well as discussions with the Palestinians to come up with some formula so that the Palestinians would withdraw from seeking recognition of a Palestinian state. However, the Palestinians have stated that they will press ahead and they will seek for this recognition at the United Nations, despite threats from the United States that they will use their veto power in the UN Security Council to prevent full recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital at the United Nations. So the Palestinians have announced that they have agreed to the plan in which they are going to pursue. And even though they're being told that there is going to be a veto by the United States if the proposal is brought up at the United Nations through the UN Security Council, the Palestinians are also seeking to get recognition of a Palestinian state through the United Nations General Assembly. And in order to do that, they need two-thirds approval of UN member countries, which is approximately 128 to 130 countries giving recognition for a Palestinian state. Right now, the Palestinians are saying that there are 122 nations in the world who are committed to recognize a Palestinian state through the UN General Assembly. And so that recognition would give the Palestinians greater rights in the United Nations than what they have now, but they would not have full and complete rights, as would be the case if their bid is recognized by the UN Security Council. So the Palestinians are putting on a diplomatic blitz of their own to try to convince various nations of the world to recognize a Palestinian state. And Lebanon is going to be heading the 15-member UN Security Council in September, and Lebanon has indicated that they will recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations, and the Palestinians have said other countries will be doing so in the upcoming weeks, and among them being Ecuador. As one Israeli response to the Palestinians' desire to seek recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations, a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, Danny Danon, is trying to start a campaign initially through Facebook and then get political support throughout Israel, given that Danny Danon is a member of the Israeli Knesset, and he's seeking to get Israel to annex all of the West Bank should the Palestinians go forward and get recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations. Danny Danon believes that a unilateral action by the Palestinians should result in a unilateral action by Israel as well. And he is arguing that previous Israeli governments have taken unilateral actions and annexed East Jerusalem to be a part of Israel, as well as the Golan Heights. Meanwhile, there are protests going on within Israel regarding the high cost of living in the nation. And it's being reported that as many as 250,000 Israelis have marched in the last week or so in Israel demanding social reform of the Israeli government. And in responding to these concerns, Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu, he has commissioned within his government a committee that will seek to try to see what is the best way for the government of Israel to address these concerns without bankrupting the nation of Israel itself if it would agree to too many of the demands of the parties concerned. So these are the major developments that are happening in Israel in the past week or so. And so there is tremendous amount of diplomatic activity that is going forward regarding the peace process. And given that the opening of the United Nations Assembly for the new year, which is going to be the 66th year of the United Nations, this is only now about a month away. And so there's tremendous amount going on wherein the Palestinians are seeking to get a Palestinian state. Israel is trying to prevent one, and Israel is lobbying the nations of the world against it. The Palestinians are lobbying for it. The United States and Israel are also trying hard to get both sides to come together at the last minute and enter into direct negotiations, seeking to have the Palestinians withdraw their bid for recognition of a Palestinian state. That covers the news for this week. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.